From stabilizing the camera to Marvel CGI. By harnessing the power of motion tracking, you're able to reconstruct the movements of your camera in digital space, which gives you full control over your footage to add or remove anything you want. What's up, animators? In this video, I'll teach you everything about motion tracking as well as how to use Blender to get a perfect camera track every single time. And if you like the sound of that, come on, you know what I want you to do. Just hit the bell and like the video. Comment. Let's begin. If you want to add anything on top of your footage, you need to perfectly replicate the motion of your camera, otherwise that thing will just slide around. If it is rendered with the same camera movement though, it looks like it's actually there in the scene. Makes sense. So to do that, we have to do three things. First, we have to match the settings of the camera and the lens with our digital camera. Then we have to track the footage, which comes with a lot of tiny nuances that I'll explain later. And finally, solve the camera motion and set up our scene. Step number 1 is when you film your video, write down your focal length, your frame rate, your f-stop, your focus point, your sensor size, and resolution of the video. If you don't know these things, it's not a problem, it just helps if you do. This will make it easier to match your real-life camera settings with your CGI to make it more believable. So look up your phone and camera on Google to find these settings. It will help you. Before we begin the motion tracking process, we also have to convert our video file into an image sequence. Blender can perform motion tracking on video files just fine, but in case your video was encoded with an interframe compression or long GOP compression, you might run into critical issues with the track. These compressions essentially save every other frame and move the existing pixels around to fill in the missing frames. It does that to reduce the file size, but it's not ideal for motion tracking purposes. To do that, open up Blender and change the 3D viewport into a video sequencer. Click on Add and add a movie. Select your recorded video and then go into the Output Properties panel. Make sure the resolution and frame rate match your recorded video. If you don't know these settings, you can always right-click the video file, select Properties, drop down Details, and it will be displayed there. Set the start and the end frame of the video to make sure you're exporting a PNG sequence. You can also drop down the compression. Now this feature is usually on by default, but just to be sure, double check that in the post-processing dropdown, the sequencer option is ticked on. Set an output location and render the animation by pressing Ctrl and F12. And now that we have our video in the form of an image sequence, we can dive into the heavy stuff. Open up Blender and change your viewport to the movie clip editor. Then change the timeline to the movie clip editor as well, but change the clip option into the graph. These are the two windows that we'll be working with. In the clip editor, click Open and browse for your image sequence. You can press A on your keyboard to select them all. Now in the output properties, set your original frame rate, and in the clip dropdown on the top left, click the Set Scene Frames. This will make the project as long as your video, as well as Prefetch, which will prefetch the frames from your disk so it'll play back faster and track faster as well. Also, going to the render settings, drop down the Color Management tab and set the View Transform to Standard to keep the original video colors. The project is now set, so let's enter the information of the camera. In the track sidebar, drop down Camera and then Lens. This is where you enter your sensor width, which you can Google for almost any device, or you can use one of the presets provided by Blender. The pixel aspect ratio is for devices that work with anamorphic optics. Most of you will probably have to leave that at 1. Focal length is something we all know, so if you know that information, put it in, and if not, Blender can guess most of these automatically, and I'll show you how in the solving part of this video. The lens's optical center is optimally in the center of your frame, but with cheaper lenses it can be offset. So unless you have the technical data of your specific lens, there's no reasonable option to figure it out, so just let Blender do it for you automatically. Don't go manually trying all the combinations to see if the solve error goes down. Please don't do that. You can actually figure out the distortion coefficients by turning on the grid in the clip display and trying to match the grid with the edges of your video. Polynomial is for regular lenses, Division is for heavy fisheye lenses, Nuke is the distortion model used by the Nuke compositing software, and Brown is an advanced mathematical distortion model with up to 4 different coefficients. If there's no visible edges on your video, Blender can still do it for you. Before we move on to the tracking, I just want to say that in the footage sidebar, you have access to the metadata of your image sequence, and you can also work with lower resolution proxies of the video to improve your performance, and then of course put it back to full resolution in the end. We have our camera, with the exception of the f-stop, which we'll do later. Now let's begin the second step. Footage tracking. If you want to track your footage, you need at least 8 active trackers on your video, so let's talk about what those are. Trackers are little patterns from your frames that are being tracked onto the footage. A tracker consists of the pattern itself and the search size around it. An example of how this works is if you imagine a video of walking down a block, you put a tracker on one of the windows. When you place it, you define the pattern, and in the next frame, it will search for that same pattern within its search size and snap directly on it. That way, it always tracks the location of the window on your 2D footage and stores its position attribute so later it can be used to calculate the camera solve. Bleh, tongue twister. It does that with an algorithm which is beautifully explained by the principles of computer vision in their video series, Optical Flow, the structure of motion and object tracking. I'll leave the link down in the description for those of you who want to learn more. It is some fascinating math that I don't understand myself. Maybe one day. But yeah, it's there. We do this process because with enough trackers, 8, placed in various depths, Blender can calculate the exact motion of the camera using some good old trigonometry. Imagine shooting out rays from the camera sensor through your tracked 2D points and taking into account all the camera settings, such as the focal length, the lens distortion, and so on, and based on the relative movements between those points, do some math to define where those points were in 3D space when the camera was filming them. You know, also taking into account the distortion of the lens and stuff. I've already said that before, but it's really fascinating stuff. Because the camera filmed those landmarks, that window and that little dot on the sidewalk, it was filmed in 3D space and encoded onto a 2D video, or image sequence. If we have a relative map on how these things are moving on a 2D canvas, we can reverse engineer where they were in 3D space when they were filmed, and also how the camera was moving when it was recording them. Math. Math is cool. That's also why Blender can just guess your focal length and distortion coefficients and stuff like that. The math is mathing. That's also why it's really important to get your trackers to track accurately, and I'm here to show you how to do that. Besides the pattern size and search size, which can be quickly set with Blender's different motion presets, trackers also have different motion models, different match types, options for prepassing and normalizing, and individual RGB channels. Let's take a look at what those are, leaving motion models for last because reasons. The match type lets you choose between keyframe and previous frame. Whenever you make changes to the marker, such as moving, rotating, scaling, or anything, you set a so-called keyframe for the pattern. The tracker will then try to search for that pattern in every frame until it gets too unrecognizable and you just have to set another keyframe. That setting is great if you want to stay exactly on point because there's no better reference than the original pattern itself. The previous frame option will look for the pattern and treat that frame as the new keyframe every single time. So it's always looking for the pattern it got from the previous frame. This option is great for the cases where the feature point gets distorted a lot, so it always stays on track. However, sometimes it can get a little bit off, so it has to be controlled. So you have two match types for two different uses. The prepass. Oversimplified, it will use 2 passes on the tracker, making it more accurate. Just keep it on at all times. The normalize option will normalize the light values of the pattern, making it easier to track the footage with a lot of light changes, like the sunlight being blocked by a cloud or the feature point moving into the shadow of a different object. Oversimplified, it looks at the light values within the pattern relatively rather than objectively. The RGB channels let you toggle the red, green, and blue channels from being included in the track or not. This feature is useful if you want to cut down on the tracking time, having to track only 1/3 of what you normally would have tracked, or if your footage has different colors with similar light values. As the trackers only look at the brightness values, it might be useful to turn the green channel off here and it's going to be tracked easier. You can also copy all those settings from one tracker onto another tracker. Just note the tracker you're copying this from has to be the active selection. Tracking settings extra. Here you can define the tracker's weight, which I'll explain in the camera solving part where it's more relevant. You can set the marker's threshold with the correlation setting, where the value of 1 will look for a perfect match in the pattern and lower values will say, that's close enough, that's my pattern. It's useful if there's a lot of repetitive patterns and you want your tracker to stay on the very specific one. Raise the value, it's only gonna look for the exact set of pixels. You can fine tune it here. The margin setting will set a margin around your image border where the tracker stops tracking if it gets too close. That's useful to avoid faulty trackers due to lens distortion. Are you feeling it? You can also tick on Use Mask, where you can use the grease pencil tool to mask off parts of the pattern and only track a specific part of it. And finally, motion models. Motion models define what your trackers look for when tracking. We know location, location and rotation, location and scale, location, rotation and scale, perspective, and affine motion models. Location will only look at the pattern's location. It won't take into account the camera tilt, resulting in the pattern being rotated, or the camera moving physically closer to the pattern, making it bigger. This is where the location, rotation, and scale model comes in handy, because it will move, rotate, and scale your tracker to fit it onto the footage and track your landmark as your footage is moving around. That's the general setting you want to be using. Then perspective model will also take into account the skew of the pattern, as if it had a change in perspective and got skewed. And the affine model will look for deformations such as skewing and stretching of the feature point, and it's often the most popular form of tracking, however it is the slowest. You've got a track sidebar on the left and a track sidebar on the right. The one on the left determines the settings of all the individual trackers you're going to spawn from this point onwards, and the track sidebar on the tracking settings panel drop down on the right determines the settings of individual trackers, which can also be changed mid-track. So you can track half of your footage, decide to change the settings, and continue to track without losing any of the tracking data you've collected so far. The settings on the right also have the option of frames limit, which will limit the amount of frames the tracker will be tracked for every time you try to track the scene, as a way to control the trackers in little intervals. It also has a speed setting, which will track faster or slower for you to observe it better. The speed setting won't affect the quality of the tracker though. That's just for you to pay attention. You can add these markers on the marker dropdown on the left, after you've selected all your settings, or you can control-click the image. You can then reposition these trackers or even change their settings in the tracker settings panel on the right if you haven't done that before, and then click the track markers icon or press Ctrl-T for the shortcut. That will track all the selected trackers for as long as it can. You can also track the trackers backwards by clicking this icon or pressing Shift, Ctrl and T, gotta love the shortcuts, or only tracking back and forth by one frame with these two icons or by holding Alt and pressing the left and right arrow keys. Pay attention to these trackers and fix them when they go rogue. You can actually see your trackers better in the track panel on the right in this little window up here. I use it all the time, so you should too. It helps a lot if you track individual trackers one by one, and once you're done with them, press Ctrl and L to lock them so you can't override them by accident. But for a quick and dirty job, you can also click the Detect Features button, which will add a bunch of trackers that will still respect their tracker settings, mind you, then tweak the margin, threshold, and coverages in the pop-up window down below and track them all at once. But that does a worse job than doing it manually. If the tracker is having issues, open the tracker settings panel on the right and tweak the marker settings. Like I've said, you can change these mid-track without losing any of the data you've collected so far. Keep tweaking it, making use of your new knowledge of motion models. You can clear all the tracking information before or beyond a certain point, or even refine it from the last keyframe to the current point in both directions. You can merge two different trackers into a single track, which is useful if your tracker gets obscured and you want to continue the track when it's visible again. Or select two overlapping trackers and average them. This is useful for improving stability with blurry footage, as it averages the positions of all the trackers. If your tracker is deforming in weird ways, don't worry, the tracker only stores the position information. As long as that little plus is in the same feature, you're good. Even though you're using the perspective and rotation models, that rotation is only used to position that tracker on your video. The only thing the tracker is using is that new position, and it's being shown on the graph below. The red lines represent positions of the trackers of the x-axis of your footage, and the green lines represent the y-axis. If most of them are going the same way, that means the camera motion track is very solid, as that's what you would expect from a rotating or tilting camera. Similar movement for all the trackers. Let's talk about offset. If your tracker gets obscured but you want to continue tracking while it's invisible, you can use the tracker offset in the marker dropdown in the track panel on the right. Again, it doesn't ruin any of the tracking data from before, but you can offset your marker, track a different pattern, and record that tracking data to the original spot. Once your original pattern is visible again, you can put the offset to 0 and track again like normally. You just have to be careful not to move too far away from the original location, as the lens distortion might distort the track, making it less reliable. And also to obviously place the offset onto something stationary. Your goal is to use a reference point of something else to estimate where the original point is, so stay close to that. This is also where you find the numerical values for your tracker's position, the pattern area, search area's position, and its height and width, and you can tweak all those parameters individually to customize your tracker as much as you need. Plane track. You can track and replace planar features on your clip by selecting 4 trackers, preferably on the same plane, opening the Solve panel on the left, and in the Plane Track dropdown, click Create Plane Track. That will create a rectangular mask around your 4 trackers, where you can move the points around to match the feature you're trying to replace. In the track panel on the right in the Plane Track dropdown, you can rename your plane track, animate it with auto keyframe in case it's not accurately tracked, you can give it a different texture to replace it, or you can turn the plane into an image, modify it in Photoshop to remove some features, and import it back. There's also an opacity slider to help you work. The way you add this image in your final video is in the Compositing tab. By adding your image, running it through the plane track deform, and selecting your track camera in the actual plane track, then putting that above your original footage with the Alpha Over node. But that's not a compositing tutorial, so let's move on. Stabilization. Motion tracking can also be used to stabilize your footage. You will find it in the Stabilization panel on the right. Turn on 2D Stabilization. By default, it will stabilize the location, but you can also include rotation and scale to be stabilized as well. Then you can just select the tracker and click on the plus icon to assign it. The rotation and scale stabilization requires 2 trackers or more, since it uses the angle and distance between them to rotate and scale your footage in the opposite direction to make it appear stationary. But the location only needs 1, although you can assign more if you want to. The anchor frame option will be the reference point in the clip it'll try to stabilize to. The auto scale feature will automatically zoom in on your footage to hide the edges of your image as it's moving around, and it lets you set the maximum scale as well. Or you can turn it off and set the scale manually. You can also offset the target position and rotation to align your footage, or set the influence of location, rotation, and scale changes to tune down the stabilization effect. And finally, you can set the interpolation method on your footage. Basically, how the pixels will be interpolated on a sub-pixel level after you've applied the stabilization transforms. It's a very minuscule thing, but it could be important for the look and feel of the video. The setting works in the same way as any other image or video editing softwares. To actually apply the stabilization to your final video, you open the Compositing tab and add a stabilized 2D node to your tree. Make sure you select your clip, where all of you crazy psychos out there can also invert the option if you want to. Object tracking. You can track individual objects as well. In the track panel on the right, in the Objects dropdown, click the plus icon to add a new object. Now you can track features on a moving object. Oh, you also have to solve object motion. Open the Solve panel on the left, drop down Geometry, and click 3D Markers to Mesh. This will create a vertex cloud with a vertex placed in every one of your trackers. You can give this vertex cloud an object solver constraint. Select the object and the camera, and then set the inverse to get the movement of your object transferred to the cloud as well. The Link Empty to Object button will create an empty object for all the selected trackers, and give it a constraint to make it follow the motion of the trackers. These 2 options are great for reference points over which you can add your CGI. Cleanup, that's important. Clean your rooms, kids. Above the Geometry dropdown, there's a dropdown called Cleanup, which is where you can quickly get rid of all your bad and problematic trackers. You can either select, delete segments of trackers, or delete entire trackers that track less than a certain amount of frames, or had an error higher of the specified number. Now, I still haven't explained what this mystical error is or why the solve is important, but I'll talk about this when I get to the solving part of the video, which is soon. I just have to get through all the features first. Finally, annotations. You can add annotations to the project to make notes for yourself. You've got a few different tools here, and you can attach them to your view or the clip, and you can control how they're visible in the View panel on the right, where you can also control the thickness, opacity, layers, and the placement of these annotations. It is just a useful tool to help you stay organized. And finally, it is time to transfer the movements of your real-life camera into Blender, so you can finally add all of your glorious CGI. This step involves you telling Blender what to look for when organizing all the data you got from your markers and using that to calculate your camera motion. So let's begin. Open the Solve panel on the left and drop down Solve. The tripod button should only be used when the camera hasn't physically moved a lot during the recording of the video, and it just rotated in place, as if you're recording with a tripod, like I am right now. That tells Blender not to add location to the camera solve. Footage like this is usually harder to work with because it resolves in a lack of scene depth, so it comes down to the artist. The keyframe setting will take a time frame of your clip, between the start point, keyframe A, and the end point, keyframe B, and use that as a reference to reconstruct the camera motion. It's usually good to pick a part of the video with the most perspective change to give Blender a better idea of the scene, or if you're not sure, Blender can pick the most optimal keyframes for you, although it can be drunk sometimes. Then, if you don't know your hardware specifications, as I've said in the beginning, you can let Blender guess your focal length, optical center, and the radial and tangential distortions. Sometimes, even if you do know your specifications, due to the margin of error, it's going to be off by a little bit, so letting Blender guess the specs you already know could help you make the solve even better. To solve the camera motion, you just click Solve Camera Motion. It's gonna take a second and you'll be met with this solve error text. Genuinely speaking, anything above 1 pixel is utter garbage, anything below 1 pixel is usable, and anything above 0.5 pixels is optimal. That's what I want. If your solve error is too high, you can turn on tracker information from the display dropdown and start deleting the tracks that have a really high average error, as they're unreliable and are messing with your camera track. If a tracker's average error isn't horribly bad, you can just drop down the track panel on the right and decrease that tracker's weight. Told you I'm gonna explain, I didn't forget. This will make the tracker less significant while calculating the solve, but it will still consider it. This is also where you can set the weight for the trackers being used for stabilizing the footage, or change your tracker's color in case you're tracking multiple different things to stay organized. So if the tracker is horrible, delete it. If it's not that bad, decrease its weight. but if you drop the weight of too many of them, none of them will be reliable anymore and the track's gonna be worse, so find a balance. If you run out of good trackers, simply add more and repeat the process until your track is flawless. Every single piece of footage is trackable. Fight me. Final step. I've hit this microphone like 12 times during the recording of this video. Like the video to stop microphone abuse. Final steps are setting up your scene. Drop down the Scene Setup panel and click Set as Background, which will set your undistorted footage as the background clip of your camera, to help you work on the scene better. And click Set up Tracking Scene, which will add 2 collections, 2 render layers, a shadow catcher, and some compositor nodes. I dive more into this in my previous tracking tutorial, which is more practical and less technical, so do give it a watch if you're interested. If your scene is not oriented properly, you can always select 3 trackers on the floor and click Set Floor to properly level your scene. You can also do that with a wall. Select one of the trackers and click Set Origin to set that tracker as the center of your scene. Then select one of the trackers on its side relative to the scene and select Set X-axis or Set Y-axis. This will rotate the scene so the tracker is aligned on the specific axis from your world origin. You can also select 2 trackers, set their distance in meters with this setting, and then either setting that scale by scaling the camera or applying that scale to the solution itself, so the distance between the selected tracks is equal to what you have set. If you're doing physics simulations, it's best to apply the scale, but if not, it doesn't matter, it's gonna look the same. If the track is still a bit off in your 3D viewport and things are sliding, just make sure you move the camera so the trackers on the floor are on the same place as your floor itself. I can guarantee you, if the solve error was small, it's going to look flawless. And now you can finally animate your CG scene. If you want to see a full breakdown on how I did some of these shots, you should once again check out my previous tutorial on camera tracking. I go through the entire process in front of your eyes in 25 minutes, but I don't dive into the explanations and visual examples as I did here. So that is it, you should now be a master in camera tracking. Now I do have one thing to ask from you. I want you to send me your motion track stuff in my Discord server, simply because I like them. I want to see what you guys do with this. This is fun. Now this video is probably long enough as it is, so all I'm gonna say now is thank you for watching, happy animating, and stay sharp.